So welcome to Module 3. We said that nothing that we enjoy throughout the United States today in terms of protection and fair housing came easily. In fact, it came through a lot of sacrifices through many people over many decades. So before we can move forward in the course, we have to have a better understanding of fair housing history. So we're going to do something that's a bit unusual and is rarely done. In talking about the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, we're going to pull old Abe down today from his ivory pedestal. And we're going to try and look at the world not through the eyes of the idol or the demagogue or the way that we sometimes see Lincoln portrayed today. This time, we're going to take a look at the world through the eyes of Abe Lincoln as if he were a real person, because I assure you that he was. So, throughout the world today, Abraham Lincoln is known for two huge accomplishments during his presidency. He certainly was the president who preserved the Union. Every school child, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, knows him as the president who preserved the Union. And we also give him credit today for an important part of fair housing, the 1866 Civil Rights Act. But I said today we were going to try and look at those two events through the eyes of Lincoln as a real person. I love showing you things in class that I think you're not ever going to forget. So if you'll take out a $20 bill and look at the back of it. On the back of every $20 bill is the north portico of the White House. And that engraving shows pillared columns, and in between those two pillars, in the top story window, is where Abraham Lincoln leaned on in April of 1865 and said, "We should not discriminate against people on the basis of race or color." You know, it doesn't sound that shocking to us today, but on the date when that was first said, in 1865, it was the first time that any such words had ever been uttered by an American president. We credit that to Abraham Lincoln, and it's preserved forever, right there on the back of your $20 bill. You know, off to the right is the Prince of Wales room in the upper level of the White House. It's part of the residential section. And that's the room in which Abe Lincoln's body lied for autopsy and embalming just a few short days after making that statement. Because the truth of history is as follows. Abraham Lincoln certainly lived to see the end of the Civil War, because on April 10th of 1865, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, and Lincoln was the leading force in seeing that war to its end. But that night, that fateful night, at Ford's Theater, was supposed to be a celebration and a chance of rest for Abraham Lincoln before all the hard work of Reconstruction and pulling this country back together had ever really begun. So while Lincoln lived to see the end of the Civil War, Lincoln never knew whether or not we ever again became a unified country. In fact, from that vantage point of history through his eyes, we should all know that Abraham Lincoln died not really knowing whether or not today you would hold in your hands a bill which says, "In the United States of America." It happened because of what he did. The problem is, he just never lived to see it. So if you ever wonder if the things that you say and do on a daily basis really do have some meaningful or lasting impact, take a look at the back of a $20 bill. You'll be reminded of that story. We said he's also known for the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and that's because it logically followed from all of the work he did during the Civil War with the Emancipation Proclamation. Except the 1866 Civil Rights Act didn't pass easily. And in fact, it was vetoed by President Johnson, and Congress overrode the veto to bring that law into full force and effect. By the way, if you're keeping track of the dates, it's the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, which means the two major things with which we credit him and recognize his achievements today are two things that Abraham Lincoln never lived to see to reality. The 1866 Civil Rights Act did not mean back then what it means to us today. In fact, for the first 100 years of that law's enforcement, Congress held that the words equal justice under law were only meant to keep the government from discriminating, and that we as private citizens in residential sales transactions could continue to discriminate. In fact, there's a little footnote to history, and it happens on the back of your $5 bill. On the back of the $5 bill is an engraving of the Lincoln Memorial, built in 1916. And in 1916, when that building was completed and about to be dedicated in Washington, D.C., the committee chose a gentleman to deliver the keynote address. At the time, he was the president of the Tuskegee Institute, a black man. And when he arrived that day to give dedication to the memorial in Washington, D.C. for the man who first preached an end to discrimination, he was asked to sit in the colored section. It's a sad but true footnote to history, because even some 65-odd years after Lincoln's death, the fact of the matter is that America was still heavily and racially divided. It wouldn't be until the mid-1960s when Martin Luther King Jr., talking about bringing America together and helping heal some of those wounds, would be successful at his efforts. And in case you thought all of that came easily, it was a very tumultuous time. This video will help bring back some of those memories.
Some of the good people of both races who live under the protection of the United States may not be satisfied with the decision of the Supreme Court.
The law is there to uphold the human principle, that there is equal justice because we feel it in our hearts, that this is the law of our hearts. And I think all of us now are very sober in realizing that unless we integrate, we shall very quickly disintegrate.
Now, therefore, I, George C. Wallace, as governor of the state of Alabama, do hereby denounce and forbid this illegal and unwarranted action by the central government.
The President of the United States and the Attorney General have encouraged demonstrations.
To be given the rights of a human being?
I think you're not going to ever eat here. Now, do you oppose the business? Is that what you want to do? You can't eat here.
If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place?
Put it on TV! Put it on TV! I want the world to see this!
We will march in Washington on August 28, 1963, along with hundreds of thousands of our fellow Americans who believe in equal opportunity and freedom for us all.
Now, we don't have any Rockefellers in our midst. We don't have any Henry Fords. But we do have a king. We've got Martin Luther King. And I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
So when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on a balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, the outrage and the uproar created by his death led President Johnson to pass into law, for the first time in United States history, something that has become known as the 1968 Fair Housing Act. It's the leading body of law today that applies to fair housing. Except it was introduced in 1966. Why did it not become the 1966 Civil Rights Act? And that's because even 100 years after Lincoln's death, in 1966, Congress and President Johnson couldn't get the votes together to pass into law a simple statute which said we should not discriminate against each other in residential sales transactions. It happened because of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, which just led me to realize there's another entire individual who lived his whole life believing and fighting for a cause, except Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. died, never having seen this country pass into law so much as one piece of legislation affecting residential sales. It happened because of his death. He just never lived to see it. And in the 1968 Act, we created specific prohibitions of conduct that we were trying to eliminate in the fair housing world. And it fell across 5 protected classes: race, color, creed, national origin, and sex was actually added in 1974. So, if you're in a protected class, here's a good time for you to take a break. If you're in a protected class, stand up. Go ahead, take a break from your computer. By the way, all of you should be standing. That's because each and every one of us is in a protected class. I can't tell you how many times teaching fair housing courses I have heard comments from real estate professionals and even some of the consuming public about why should certain people get protected and be in protected classes and get treated differently from the rest of us. It's not what fair housing was all about. The protected classes didn't protect groups of people, they protected conduct in certain areas. See, we're all in a protected class. You're in a protected class because of your religion. You're in a protected class because of your national origin. Here's a twist on the old standard for you. If you're a white Caucasian male, you're protected in 2 classes. 1 because you're white, 2 because you're male. See, the protected classes are meant to afford the same opportunities and availability of housing for all of us. In the 1968 Act, some of the conduct which they were trying to prohibit included certain terms like blockbusting, the notorious practice of brokers going into neighborhoods and actually trying to encourage people to move based on the racial or ethnic makeup of that neighborhood. You know, we find it kind of hard to believe that these practices even occurred today, but I'll give you an example. If a broker walked into a neighborhood and knocked on a door, they would say, "Hey, have you heard? You need to move because those people are coming." And they would list the property, and then they themselves would actually bring other racial or ethnic people to that house and then slowly and methodically work their way to the neighborhood. The real tragedy of the fact is they would do this over and over again. One year they'd be working throughout a white neighborhood, knocking on it, bringing black folks into the neighborhood and encouraging the white people to move. And a year later, they'd be back knocking on the black person's door, telling them the Hispanics were moving into the neighborhood. And a year later, knocking on the Hispanics' door, telling them that Asian people were moving into the neighborhood. It was a notorious practice, and it was encouraged and wasn't illegal in the 1960s. It's one of the reasons the 1968 Act was passed. The second major type of conduct that the 1968 Act sought to prohibit was redlining, that of drawing lines around particular geographic areas. And maps, such as the one you're looking at, done by a guy named Spangler, were purchased by banks and lenders. He labeled certain neighborhoods as desirable or good or bad based on the demographic, ethnic, and national origin makeups of those neighborhoods. It was another practice eliminated by the 1968 Act. And finally, the practice of steering, moving or directing people to or from certain neighborhoods based on any of the protected class categories. You know, I would like to believe that I am aware enough of fair housing that I don't make prejudgments or have preconceptions. But I'm going to move steering from 1960 right up into the present. And I'm going to do it with the example of this house. I want you to see how easy it is that those preconceptions and misconceptions get created in our head. See this home? This home is a $3.5 million mansion in Palm Beach, Florida. And it's owned free and clear by a 27-year-old Jewish male. Quick, how is a guy like that able to afford this house? See, most of you instantly thought, well, he comes from money. Well, of course he does. He's Jewish. Let me change the fact pattern slightly. This $3.5 million house in Palm Beach, Florida, is owned free and clear by a 6'2" black male. Yeah, most of you are already trying to figure out what team he plays for. See, we instantly attach those stereotypes. Can we do one more? This house, $3.5 million in Palm Beach, is owned free and clear by a 25-year-old Hispanic male. Yeah, you don't even have to say it. We all know it's drugs. See how quick? We don't even need to see the people anymore. We just see their home, and we make conclusions based on the stereotypes along racial, ethnic, and religious lines that lead us to conclusions that are inconsistent with the enforcement of fair housing. So I hope those examples open your eyes a little bit, and I hope the history helps you understand that this journey that we're on has indeed been a long way home.